Hey there, welcome to Broaderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The fog of eyes. Have you ever driven through a fog so thick you felt like it had a mind of its own? I never believed in any of that supernatural nonsense. Ghosts, spirits, haunted places, just stories to scare kids or pass time around campfires. But then something happened. Something so unreal that I can't explain it to myself, let alone anyone else. Yet, every time I close my eyes, I see it again. It started as a simple trip. A few of us, me, Jake, Ellie, and Mark, decided to take a road trip to another state for the weekend. We had planned everything: food, music, and even a few stops at quirky roadside attractions. It was supposed to be fun, nothing more. But fun wasn't exactly what we got. We'd been driving for hours when the fog first appeared. At first, it seemed normal, just a light mist rolling in over the hills as we crossed the state line. But soon, it thickened. It wasn't like any fog I had ever seen before. It didn't settle over the ground, didn't roll along the valleys. No, this fog moved, coiled, almost alive, as if it was watching us. At that moment, we didn't realize what it was. We just thought it was an odd weather phenomenon. "I think we should pull over," Ellie said from the back seat, her voice a bit shaky. "Visibility is getting worse." Jake, who was driving, shrugged. "It's just fog. Nothing to worry about. It'll clear up soon." I wasn't so sure. Something about the way the fog moved unsettled me. It wasn't just thick, it had texture, layers, shifting in and out like tendrils of smoke. And then, I saw them. Eyes. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, the exhaustion from driving for hours messing with my mind. But no, there they were. Dozens of eyes, glowing faintly in the distance, scattered in the fog like fireflies. Except they didn't blink. They just stared. "Did you see that?" I whispered, leaning forward in my seat, trying to get a better look. "See what?" Jake asked, his eyes still on the road. I didn't want to say it out loud. "Nothing, I guess." But I knew it wasn't nothing. The eyes, they were there, watching us, getting closer. I turned to Ellie and Mark, sitting in the back, but they hadn't noticed anything. Yet. I thought maybe I was the only one seeing it, that my mind was playing tricks. Until Mark spoke up. "What the hell is that?" His voice cracked, and he pointed toward the fog. My stomach twisted. He saw them too. Jake slowed down the car as the fog thickened further, swallowing the road ahead. It became so dense, the headlights barely cut through it. It was like driving into a wall of light. The eyes, though, they were clearer now, and there were more of them. Not just scattered here and there, but hundreds, maybe thousands, glowing faintly in the mist, blinking in unison. Watching. Waiting. "We need to stop," Ellie said again, more urgently this time. Jake finally agreed and pulled over onto the shoulder of the road. We all sat there in the car, engines off, in total silence. The only sound was our own breathing, shallow and tense. "What the hell is going on?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, but I think we should stay in the car. We stayed there for what felt like hours, watching the fog outside swirl and shift. The eyes, at first distant, began to draw closer. They weren't just in front of us anymore, they were everywhere. I could see them through the rearview mirror, glowing through the fog on all sides. There was no way around it. We were surrounded. We have to do something, Jake muttered, gripping the steering wheel. But what could we do? We couldn't see the road ahead, and getting out of the car felt like the worst idea in the world. Something was out there, hidden in the fog, watching us. And it wasn't friendly. I felt a strange chill crawl up my spine. I turned to Ellie, but she was staring straight ahead, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. Mark's knuckles were white as he gripped the seat in front of him. "What are those things?" Ellie finally asked, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. Then, without warning, the car lurched forward. Jake hadn't touched the gas. None of us had moved. But the car, it slid, as if something had grabbed hold of it from the outside and was pulling us deeper into the fog. The headlights flickered, and in that brief moment, I saw them. Figures. Not just eyes anymore. Figures with long, shadowy limbs, crawling through the fog, moving toward the car. They were barely visible, their bodies shifting in and out of the mist like phantoms, but the eyes, they were all I could see. Cold, lifeless eyes. "We need to go," I shouted, grabbing Jake's arm. He didn't respond. None of them did. They were all frozen, staring ahead, eyes wide, as if they were in a trance. "Jake! Move!" I yelled again, shaking him, but it was no use. The fog pressed closer, thicker, suffocating. The figures were getting closer, their glowing eyes burning through the mist, and I couldn't take it anymore. I reached over, slamming my hand down on the horn, hoping the noise would break whatever spell had fallen over them. The sound echoed through the fog, a sharp, blaring noise, but it didn't scatter the figures. If anything, it seemed to excite them. I could see them now, clearly. Tall, gaunt shapes with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Their mouths were twisted into wide, unnatural grins, though their eyes, those horrible eyes, remained emotionless, fixed on us. And then they were on us. The car shook violently as the figures swarmed around it, their hands, if you could call them hands, slapping against the windows, clawing at the doors. I screamed, but no sound came out. My mind was numb with terror. They were trying to get in. The eyes. All I could see were the eyes. I wanted to scream, but the sound seemed stuck in my throat. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I reached for Jake, shaking him violently. He still hadn't moved, his knuckles bone white against the steering wheel. It was as if he was in a trance, staring into the fog, completely frozen. "Jake, snap out of it!" I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of panic. No reaction. None of them moved. It was as if time had stopped for them, while I was left to face whatever horror was unfolding outside. The car shuddered again, harder this time. The figures, those gaunt, twisting shadows, were closer now, their grotesque limbs slithering across the windows like dark vines. Each one moved in ways that defied the laws of nature, bodies bending at impossible angles, long fingers tapping rhythmically against the glass. They didn't speak. They didn't make a sound. The only thing that moved were their eyes, glowing in that sickly pale light, burning into us like they could see every corner of our souls. I twisted around in my seat to look at Ellie and Mark. Ellie's face was contorted in a silent scream, her mouth open, but no sound coming out. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the glow from outside, while Mark sat beside her, rigid, gripping the seat so tightly his nails looked like they'd tear through the fabric. They were both lost, as if some invisible force had stolen their will to act. "Mark! Ellie!" I yelled, trying to break through the fog that seemed to cloud their minds. But it was useless. They were trapped in that same strange, frozen terror. The tapping on the windows grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the figures were testing the strength of the glass, their limbs pressing against it with more force, bending, stretching. I could see their grinning mouths now, wide and crooked, splitting their faces in ways that looked almost human, but not quite. Their faces, those hollow, stretched faces, seemed like masks, pale and thin, with nothing but darkness behind them. For a moment, I thought I saw something familiar in those eyes. Not just malevolence, but recognition. Like they knew us. Or worse, like they'd been waiting for us. I don't know why, but the thought lodged itself in my mind, and it terrified me more than anything else. What were they? And why were they here? Without thinking, I reached for the door handle, my instinct screaming to run, to get out, to escape whatever nightmare was closing on us. But as my fingers touched the cold metal of the door, a new thought gripped me, something darker. What if they wanted us to run? I froze, my hand hovering over the handle. The fog outside swirled violently, the shadows thickening, circling the car like vultures. I could feel their eyes on me, pressing against the windows, waiting, watching. They weren't trying to break in, they were testing us. I could sense it, deep in my bones. They were playing with us, enjoying our fear, waiting for the moment we made the wrong move. My heart pounded so hard I thought my chest would explode. Every breath felt like it was being ripped out of me, shallow, ragged gasps. I didn't dare move. I couldn't. I had never felt fear like this before, the kind that freezes you, that makes you question your every thought, your every action. Think, I whispered to myself. Think, damn it. I glanced at the dashboard. The keys were still in the ignition, but Jake wasn't moving. I could try to start the car, get us out of here, but the fog was so thick I couldn't see the road. Driving blind into that abyss felt just as dangerous as staying put. But staying felt like a slow death. I looked at Jake again, then at the others. They were still locked in their catatonic state, their eyes glazed over, fixed on the fog. And then I realized something. They weren't staring at the fog, they were staring at the eyes. The more I looked, the more I could see it. Their gazes were drawn to the glowing orbs outside, those pale, cold eyes, and it was like the fog had taken hold of them, pulling them into some kind of trance. I had to break it. I had to get them out of this. I lunged forward, grabbing Jake by the shoulders and shaking him harder this time. Jake, wake up. Please, wake up. For a second, just a second, I saw something flicker in his eyes. A faint spark of awareness, a twitch of his hand on the wheel. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. The fog, those eyes, had him again. In desperation, I leaned forward, reaching for the keys. My hand shook as I grabbed them, turning them with a loud click. The engine sputtered, the headlights flickering again, cutting through the thick mist for a brief second. But in that moment, I saw it. I saw them. The figures weren't just outside anymore. They were closer, inside the fog, their limbs reaching toward us like they were slipping through some kind of veil. One of them was right in front of the car now, its eyes larger, brighter, more focused. It wasn't just watching, it was coming for us. The headlights caught its face for just a second, revealing something that made my blood run cold. Its face, it was human. Or at least it had been. The skin was gray and mottled, like it had been stretched over something too large for its frame. Its eyes, those horrible glowing eyes, were fixed on me, unblinking. And its grin. That horrible, twisted grin. It was wide and unnatural, the lips cracked and split, as if it had been smiling for far too long. I slammed my hand on the horn again, hoping to break whatever hold the fog had over my friends, but the noise seemed to do nothing this time. The figures pressed closer, their tapping turning into scratching, their long, bony fingers scraping at the glass. I could hear the sound now, nails dragging across the windows, like they were trying to carve their way in. And then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The scratching, the tapping, it all ceased. The fog pulled back, just slightly, and for a moment, I dared to hope that it was over. But then the car shook violently, like something massive had hit it from behind. My head snapped back, slamming against the seat, and everything spun. Ellie screamed. This time, I heard her. Before I could react, the back window shattered. Glass rained down, cutting into my skin, but I barely felt it. All I could focus on was the darkness that poured in through the broken window, the cold air swirling around us, and those eyes, those terrible eyes, burning brighter now, closer, too close. And then, a hand. A long, skeletal hand, black as night, reached through the broken window, its fingers curling around Ellie's shoulder. Her scream tore through the car, sharp and deafening, and in that moment, I knew there was no escaping this. The fog had us. I froze at the sight of that hand, bony, elongated, like it was carved out of darkness itself. Ellie's scream filled the car, cutting through the suffocating silence that had surrounded us. I saw her body jerk violently as the hand tightened its grip on her shoulder, pulling her backward toward the shattered window. Her nails clawed at the seat in front of her, desperate for something to hold on to. "Ellie!" I shouted, my voice trembling as I scrambled to reach her. But before I could even touch her, the fog outside pulsed, like it was alive, responding to the chaos within the car. Another violent shudder rocked us, the entire vehicle lurching sideways as if something had grabbed hold of it. Mark, who had been sitting beside Ellie, snapped out of his trance, his eyes wild with fear as he finally saw what was happening. "Oh my God," he gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is that? What is happening?" Ellie's scream cut through again, more desperate this time. I could see the terror in her eyes as she struggled against the thing pulling her into the fog. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, her lips trembling as she mouthed a single word, "Help." I didn't think. I just acted. I lunged across the seat, grabbing her wrist and pulling with everything I had. For a second, it felt like I was winning, like I might actually be able to pull her back inside the car. But then the hand, no, the thing, tightened its grip, and I felt a force, cold and inhuman, pulling her away from me. "Mark, help me!" I screamed, panic making my voice crack. Mark was still frozen, his body rigid, as if his mind was struggling to comprehend what was happening. But something in my voice must have broken through, because he suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Ellie's other arm. Together, we pulled, the sound of her sobs filling the small space of the car, but the fog, those figures, they were too strong. The hand pulling at Ellie wasn't alone anymore. I could see them now, more of those skeletal shapes reaching out of the fog, their pale eyes glowing with that eerie light, their limbs slithering like shadows in the mist. They surrounded the car, clawing at the windows, the doors, the shattered glass. And there, just beyond the edge of the broken window, I saw it. A face. Twisted, gaunt, and horribly familiar. It was one of those things, but this one looked like it had once been human. The skin was drawn tight over its bones, gray and cracked, like it had been stretched too far. Its eyes burned with that same cold light, but its mouth, God, that mouth, was stretched into a grin that seemed too wide, too wrong. I could see its teeth, sharp and crooked, as it leaned closer, its breath fogging up the glass. Ellie was still screaming, her voice hoarse now, but I couldn't take my eyes off that face. It was so close, too close, and the longer I stared at it, the more I realized I knew that face. It was Jake. Not the Jake sitting frozen behind the wheel. No, this was a different Jake. A twisted, nightmarish version of him, like something had taken his face and warped it into something monstrous. It grinned at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw recognition in its eyes, like it knew I had seen through its disguise. "Let her go!" I shouted, my voice breaking as I pulled harder on Ellie's arm. But it was no use. The fog seemed to swallow everything, growing thicker, heavier, pressing against us from all sides. The more we pulled, the more it fought back, dragging Ellie farther and farther out of the car. I could feel her slipping away from me, her hands slick with sweat and fear. And then, with one final pull, she was gone. The fog closed in around her, swallowing her scream, her body vanishing into the mist as if she had never been there at all. I was left holding nothing but air, my hand trembling as the coldness of the fog pressed in around us. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Mark and I sat there, breathing heavily, our eyes wide with shock, as we stared into the empty space where Ellie had been. The fog swirled lazily around us, the glowing eyes still watching, waiting. "Ellie," Mark whispered, his voice broken. "Oh God, Ellie." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest so hard I thought it might burst. The weight of what had just happened hit me all at once, and I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. Ellie was gone. Just gone. Taken by whatever those things were, lost in the fog. But there was no time to grieve. The car shook again, and I realized with a sickening jolt that we were still in danger. The fog hadn't left. It was still there, surrounding us, pressing in closer, and the eyes, those damn eyes, they were still watching. I turned to Jake, still motionless behind the wheel. He hadn't moved through any of it, not even when Ellie had been dragged away. I grabbed his shoulder, shaking him roughly. "Jake, please, we have to go. We have to get out of here." But he didn't respond. His eyes were open, staring blankly ahead, his face pale and expressionless. It was like he wasn't even there anymore, like something had taken him away, just like it had taken Ellie. "Damn it, Jake!" I shouted, slamming my hand against the dashboard. "Wake up!" Mark was still shaking, his hands clutching his head as he rocked back and forth in his seat. "We're all going to die," he whispered, his voice hollow. "We're all going to die here." "No," I said, my voice firm despite the terror clawing at my insides. "We're not dying here. We're getting out." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The fog was everywhere now, suffocating us, the figures still circling, closing in. And then, as if responding to my thoughts, The car lurched forward again, harder this time, as though something massive had grabbed hold of it. The fog had taken Ellie. It had Jake. And now it was coming for us. I had no time to mourn Ellie. The fog tightened its grip on us, the dark figures pressing closer, their glowing eyes like tiny fires in the mist, flickering with some malevolent intelligence. My breath came in sharp gasps, the air in the car thick and cold. We were surrounded, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Every instinct told me to run, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. Mark sat next to me, his head in his hands, muttering to himself. He completely shut down. His eyes, once full of life, were now empty, hollow. I couldn't blame him. Ellie's sudden disappearance had broken something in him. I knew I had to act fast before the same thing happened to me. Or before the fog claimed us both. "Mark, listen to me," I said, forcing the words through my trembling lips. "We have to move. We can't stay here." But he didn't respond. He just kept muttering under his breath, his eyes vacant, lost somewhere deep in the fog that wasn't just outside the car, it had seeped into our minds. I reached for him, grabbing his arm, shaking him. "Mark. Come on, man, snap out of it." He flinched at my touch, but didn't pull away. His gaze flicked toward me for just a second, and I saw the sheer terror in his eyes, the kind of fear that grips you so tightly that you can't move, can't think, can't do anything but wait for the inevitable. But I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. "Look, we can't stay here," I said, my voice urgent. "We have to get out of the car. The fog, it's inside, Mark. It's messing with our heads. We need to move. Now." He blinked slowly, as if trying to process what I was saying. "Get out? But where do we go?" I glanced around, but the fog was impenetrable. There was no way to see more than a few feet in any direction. But staying in the car had already cost us Ellie, and Jake, whatever had happened to him, was still out of it, completely unresponsive. "We run," I said, not sure if I believed my own words. "We just run. Away from this place, away from the fog." Mark swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he fought to keep it together. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, let's go." I hesitated for just a second, staring at Jake. He was still sitting there, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes wide open but seeing nothing. I didn't want to leave him behind, but something told me there was nothing I could do for him now. The fog had him. Just like it had Ellie. With a sick feeling in my gut, I reached for the door handle. The cold metal stung my skin, sending a shiver through my body, but I forced myself to pull it. The door creaked open, and the thick, damp air of the fog rushed in, chilling me to the bone. The world outside was a wall of gray, swirling mist, alive with those twisted figures and their glowing eyes. Mark followed suit, opening his door slowly, as if afraid that the very act of leaving the car might trigger something worse. We stepped out, our feet sinking into the soft, wet ground beneath us. The fog swirled around our legs, clinging to us like cold fingers, and the oppressive silence returned, heavier than ever. "Stay close," I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice. "Don't lose sight of me." Mark nodded, his face pale and drawn. We began to walk, every step feeling like a fight against the weight of the fog, against the terror that threatened to freeze us in place. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look back at the car. I didn't want to see Jake, still trapped inside, staring into the void. I didn't want to acknowledge that we were leaving him behind. We moved slowly, every sound amplified in the thick mist. Our footsteps echoed in the silence, the crunch of leaves underfoot far too loud, like the fog was absorbing every other sound. The eyes, they were still there, watching us from just beyond the edge of the mist. I could feel them, tracking our every move, waiting for us to make a mistake. "Which way?" Mark asked, his voice a shaky whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we have to keep moving." We pushed forward, though the fog made it impossible to tell if we were going in circles or actually making any progress. I tried to keep my focus, tried to push back the rising panic, but the fog, it was more than just mist. It was alive. I could feel it, seeping into my skin, creeping into my mind. Suddenly, Mark stopped. "Did you hear that?" I paused, straining to listen. For a moment, there was nothing but the suffocating silence. And then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps, but not ours. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I saw nothing but the gray wall of fog. But then, there, just barely visible, something was moving. A shadow in the mist, slithering toward us. The eyes. There were more of them now. Dozens. Maybe more. And they were getting closer. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Mark's arm and pulling him forward. We took off, our feet pounding against the wet ground, the fog whipping around us. The footsteps, those other footsteps, grew louder, faster. The eyes moved with us, chasing us through the mist. I didn't know where we were going. I didn't care. All I knew was that we had to get away. But the fog was everywhere. It was inside us, around us, and I could feel it closing in. We ran blindly through the fog, our breaths coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The ground beneath our feet was soft, almost marsh-like, and every step felt like it was dragging us deeper into the thick, cold earth. The mist curled around us, suffocating, clinging to our skin like a wet blanket. The figures in the fog were relentless, their glowing eyes burning through the haze, following us, watching, waiting for us to tire. "Keep moving!" I shouted to Mark, though my own legs were beginning to give out beneath me. "We can't stop." Mark's breathing was labored, his face pale and slick with sweat. He didn't say anything, just nodded weakly as he stumbled forward, his eyes wide with terror. I could feel the weight of the fog pressing down on us, like it was alive, pushing against our every step. The footsteps behind us grew louder, faster. They were getting closer. Suddenly, Mark tripped. He let out a sharp cry as he hit the ground hard, his body twisting awkwardly in the mud. I skidded to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned back to help him. "Get up!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "We can't stop here." But Mark didn't move. His hands were shaking, his eyes wide as he stared into the fog. I can't move." I grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. "You have to," I said, my voice rising in panic. "We're not dying out here." But as I pulled him up, I saw something in his eyes, a glimmer of resignation, of hopelessness. He wasn't just physically tired. He was broken. The fog had gotten to him and drained whatever fight he had left. I tugged at his arm, but Mark was dead weight. His legs buckled, and he collapsed again into the wet earth. "I'm sorry," he whispered, barely audible. I can't do this anymore." No, I screamed, my voice desperate. We can make it. We just have to. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, but too distorted, too unnatural. It was close. Too close. My skin prickled with the sense of something approaching, something watching us from the fog. Slowly, I turned, my heart sinking into my stomach as I saw the shapes emerge from the mist. They were human, or at least, they had once been. Their bodies were gaunt, twisted, their skin pale and translucent, as if the life had been drained from them. Their eyes glowed with that same eerie light, but now I could see more. Their mouths were open, lips stretched unnaturally wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. And they were hungry. I pulled harder on Mark's arm, but it was no use. His eyes were still locked on the figures in the fog, his body limp, paralyzed by fear. Mark, please. I begged, my voice trembling. Get up. We have to go. But it was too late. The first figure reached him. Its long, bony hand reached out, wrapping around Mark's ankle. He let out a choked gasp, his body convulsing as the cold fingers tightened their grip. I screamed and pulled harder, but the figure was too strong. It yanked Mark toward it, dragging him through the mud, its glowing eyes locked on mine. Help! Mark whimpered, his voice weak, defeated. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't save him. I couldn't move. The fog was everywhere, the creatures closing in, their twisted faces lit by that unnatural glow. And then, with a sickening jerk, Mark was gone. The fog swallowed him, his scream cut short as the figures dragged him into the mist, disappearing into the gray abyss. I was alone. My legs trembled, and I collapsed to the ground, the mud cold and slick beneath me. My mind was spinning, my thoughts scattered, consumed by the horror of what had just happened. Mark was gone. Ellie was gone. Jake. I had left him behind. I pressed my hands against my face, trying to steady my breathing, trying to control the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm me. But there was no escaping it. The fog wasn't just around me anymore, it was inside me. It filled my lungs, my thoughts, my soul. And I knew, deep down, that there was no escape. The eyes were still there, watching, waiting. I didn't know how long I sat there, the cold seeping into my bones, my body shaking uncontrollably. The fog swirled around me, taunting me, whispering in my ear. It had won. I could feel it. The exhaustion, the fear, the hopelessness, it was all too much. I was done. And then, through the haze, I heard it. A voice. Distant, but familiar. Jake. I blinked, shaking my head, trying to clear my mind. That couldn't be right. Jake was still back in the car. He hadn't moved. He hadn't said a word since the fog had taken him. But the voice, it was his. Jake. I called out, my voice cracking. Silence. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Run. The word was barely a whisper, but it sent a shock of adrenaline through my body. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. The fog pressed in around me, but I pushed through it, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground as I followed the voice. It was coming from ahead, somewhere deeper in the fog. Jake. I shouted, my voice hoarse. Where are you?" But there was no answer. I kept moving, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. The fog twisted and swirled around me, but the eyes, they were gone. The figures had disappeared, leaving only the thick mist and the eerie silence in their wake. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know if I was running towards safety or straight into the heart of the nightmare. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I had to find him. I stumbled through the fog, my vision blurred, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The voice, Jake's voice, echoed in the mist, distant yet somehow clear. But I still couldn't see him. All around me, the gray, swirling mass moved like a living thing, blocking my view, making every step feel uncertain. "Jake!" I called again, my voice cracking, raw from the cold air that stung my throat. There was no answer this time, only the oppressive silence of the fog pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake off. My mind raced. Was it really Jake? Or was it just another trick of the fog? Another one of those things that lived in it, using his voice to lure me deeper into the mist? The thought chilled me to the core, but I had no other choice. Staying still was a death sentence. I had to keep moving. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, soft and slick with mud. I could feel my shoes sinking deeper with every step, the cold, wet earth clinging to me, slowing me down. The fog wrapped around me, thick and cold, like icy tendrils brushing against my skin, and the silence, it was suffocating. Even my own footsteps sounded muffled, as if the mist was swallowing the noise before it could escape. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The glowing eyes, they weren't gone. I could sense them, lurking just beyond my sight, hidden in the fog, waiting for the moment when I would make a mistake. They were patient, those things. They didn't need to rush. They had all the time in the world to watch me wear myself out, to watch me crumble. "Jake!" I shouted again, the desperation in my voice rising. "Please, answer me." For a moment, the only reply was the faint whistle of the wind through the trees. But then, just as I was about to give up hope, I heard it again. "Here." It was a whisper, barely audible, but it was enough. My heart surged with a mix of fear and relief. I spun around, squinting into the thick mist, trying to pinpoint where the sound had come from. It was so hard to tell, everything looked the same, an endless wall of swirling gray. But I couldn't afford to doubt it. I started moving toward the voice, my feet slipping and sliding in the mud, my body screaming for rest, but my mind refusing to let me stop. I pushed forward, every step a struggle. My legs felt heavy, like they were made of lead, and my lungs burned with every breath I took. The cold air bit into my skin, making it hard to think, hard to focus on anything but the overwhelming exhaustion that threatened to pull me down. But then, through the fog, I saw it. A shape. Dark, blurred, and indistinct at first, but as I moved closer, it became clearer. It was a figure, standing just a few feet away, motionless in the mist. My heart leapt in my chest. "Jake!" I shouted, my voice breaking. But the figure didn't move. I slowed my pace, my feet dragging as I approached the shadowy form. Something wasn't right. Jake should have moved. He should have called out to me, stepped forward, something. But the figure just stood there, silent and still, as if it was waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat. What if it wasn't Jake? What if it was something else? One of those things from the fog, wearing his shape, using his voice to pull me in? I stopped, just a few steps away, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was tall, thin, its body shrouded in the gray mist. I could barely make out any details, but there was something off about it. Something that made my skin crawl. And then, slowly, the figure turned toward me. I gasped, stumbling backward. It was Jake, but not the Jake I remembered. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes glowed with that same eerie light as the figures in the fog. He stared at me, his mouth hanging slightly open, but he didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me with those lifeless, glowing eyes. "Jake," I whispered, my voice trembling. What happened to you?" But he didn't respond. He just kept staring, his eyes boring into mine, as if he wasn't really there anymore. As if whatever was left of him had been taken by the fog, just like Ellie, just like Mark. I took a shaky step back, my hands trembling at my sides. No, this can't be real," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "This can't be happening." The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, pressing against my ears, my mind. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The fog was closing in around me, suffocating me, wrapping around my throat like a vice. And all the while, Jake just stood there, watching me with those terrible, glowing eyes. I can't stay here," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I have to go." But even as I said the words, I knew I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, my body frozen in place. The fog was inside me now, crawling through my veins, filling my lungs with its cold, oppressive weight. I was trapped. And then Jake spoke. "You can't leave." The words were flat, emotionless, but they sent a chill down my spine. His mouth barely moved, but the sound echoed in the fog, bouncing off the trees, off the mist itself, as if the fog was speaking through him. "You can't leave," he repeated, his glowing eyes locked on mine. "It won't let you." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. No, I can't stay here. I have to get out." Jake took a slow, deliberate step forward, his movements jerky, unnatural. "It's already inside you," he said, his voice hollow. "You're part of it now. Just like me. Just like all of us." I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind screaming for me to run. But no matter how hard I tried, my legs wouldn't move. The fog had me. It had all of us. Jake's face twisted into a grotesque smile, his glowing eyes burning into mine. "Don't fight it," he whispered. "You'll only make it worse." I could feel the fog tightening its grip on me, cold tendrils wrapping around my arms, my legs, pulling me deeper into the mist. My vision blurred, the world around me dissolving into a swirling, gray mass. And then, just as I was about to give in, about to let the fog consume me, I heard a sound. Distant at first, but growing louder. A car engine. My heart leapt in my chest. Was it real? Was someone coming? "Help!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "Please, help me." But Jake's twisted smile only widened. "It's too late," he whispered. "There's no escape." The low hum of the car engine reverberated through the fog, cutting through the oppressive silence. It was faint, but unmistakable, real. I wasn't imagining it. For a brief moment, hope flickered in my chest. Someone was out there. Someone who could save me from this nightmare. But then I looked at Jake, standing in the swirling mist, his eyes glowing with that eerie light, his twisted smile widening. He shook his head slowly, as if reading my thoughts. "You can't run," he whispered, his voice a cold, hollow echo. "It's already too late." The fog around him thickened, swirling in unnatural patterns, as though responding to his presence. The mist wasn't just an obstacle, it was alive, pulsating with malevolent energy. I could feel it pressing against my skin, pushing into my lungs with every breath. It felt as though the fog was trying to pull me into itself, to become part of me, just like it had with Jake. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, the cold air burning my throat. The sound of the engine was closer now, louder. But the more I tried to focus on it, the more distant it seemed, as if the fog itself was distorting the sound, twisting it, keeping it just out of reach. "Help!" I screamed again, my voice hoarse, desperate. "Someone, please! I'm here." Jake's smile didn't falter. His face had taken on an almost skeletal appearance now, gaunt, hollow, like all the life had been drained from him. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. His eyes never left mine, glowing with an otherworldly intensity that chilled me to the bone. "You're wasting your breath," he said, his voice low, mocking. "No one's coming for you. No one ever does." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't end up like him. I had to fight, even if the fog was inescapable, even if it had already sunk its claws into me. I wasn't going to give up, not yet. Without thinking, I turned and bolted into the fog. My feet slipped in the mud, my legs burning with every step, but I didn't care. I just had to get away from Jake, away from the fog that was swallowing me whole. The sound of the car engine was still there, somewhere in the distance, and I ran toward it, clinging to the last shred of hope I had left. The mist was everywhere now, thicker than ever, swirling in thick tendrils that snaked through the air like ghostly arms, reaching for me, grasping at my limbs. It felt like the fog itself was alive, trying to pull me back, to drag me into the depths where Mark, Ellie, and now Jake had disappeared. I pushed through it, my lungs burning, my throat raw. My heart pounded so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The world around me was a blur of gray, the fog so dense that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every step felt heavier, every breath harder to take, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. Then, through the thick mist, I saw it, a faint glimmer of light. Headlights. The car. My chest tightened with relief, but I didn't dare slow down. I charged toward the lights, my feet slipping and sliding in the mud, my body aching with exhaustion. The fog fought me every step of the way, swirling around me, thickening, but the light grew brighter, closer. And then, finally, I broke through. The fog parted just enough for me to see the car, a beat-up old sedan, its engine idling, its headlights casting long beams through the mist. I let out a ragged gasp, tears of relief stinging my eyes. I was so close to escaping this nightmare. I stumbled toward the car, waving my arms frantically. "Stop! Please, help me!" I screamed, my voice shaking. The driver's side window rolled down slowly, and a figure leaned out, their face obscured by the shadows and the fog. I could barely make out the silhouette of a man, his features blurred, indistinct. "Are you all right?" the man called out, his voice low, gruff. I need help," I gasped, my legs trembling beneath me. "Please, you have to get me out of here. There's something in the fog. I didn't finish my sentence. My breath caught in my throat as the fog shifted, swirling around the car, growing thicker by the second. I could see the glowing eyes in the mist again, hundreds of them, watching from just beyond the reach of the headlights. The man in the car glanced at me, his eyes narrowing. "Get in," he said quickly, his voice sharp with urgency. "Now!" I didn't hesitate. I threw open the passenger door and scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The man hit the gas, and the car lurched forward, the engine roaring as it sped down the narrow, fog-covered road. I glanced out the window, my heart still racing. The glowing eyes followed us, moving through the mist like ghosts, keeping pace with the car. I could feel them, watching, waiting. "What the hell is this place?" I whispered, more to myself than to the man. He didn't answer at first. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The headlights barely cut through the dense fog, and the car's tires skidded slightly on the slick, muddy ground. For a moment, I thought we might slide off the road, but the man kept the car steady, his jaw clenched in concentration. "It's the fog," he said finally, his voice low. "Once you're in it, it doesn't let go." I turned to him, my chest tightening. "What do you mean? How do we get out of it?" The man didn't look at me. His eyes remained locked on the road, his face pale, lined with exhaustion. "You don't," he said quietly. "Not really." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. "There has to be a way out." "You're driving." "Driving in circles," he interrupted, his voice bitter. "This isn't the first time I've been through here. This place, it's a trap. The fog, it leads you back. Every time." I shook my head, refusing to believe what he was saying. "No, that can't be right. There has to be a way out. There has to be." The man sighed, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "I've been driving for hours," he muttered. "Maybe days. I don't even know anymore." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. My breath quickened, my mind racing. No, this couldn't be it. There had to be a way out. There had to be. Suddenly, the car jerked violently to the side. The man swore under his breath, yanking the steering wheel as the tires screeched on the wet road. For a moment, I thought we were going to crash, but then the car righted itself, skidding slightly before gaining traction again. I glanced out the window, my heart pounding. The eyes were still there, glowing in the fog, but now they were closer. Much closer. They were following us, gaining on us, no matter how fast the car went. "They're coming," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know," the man muttered, his voice tense. "They always do." The car hurtled through the dense fog, the headlights barely piercing the thick, swirling mist. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tight with fear. I clutched the seatbelt across my chest, my knuckles white, as the car skidded and lurched over the slick road. The glow of the eyes in the fog was everywhere now, countless points of light watching us, closing in with every passing second. "They're getting closer," I whispered, glancing nervously out the window. The glowing eyes seemed to multiply, shifting and swaying in the mist like predators stalking their prey. I could feel their presence, cold and unnatural, filling the air around us with a sense of dread that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. The man in the driver's seat didn't respond. His face was set in a hard, determined expression, his eyes locked on the narrow stretch of road ahead. The road itself had become an endless, winding path, shrouded in mist, with no visible landmarks or signs to indicate where we were or where we were going. "How long have you been in this fog?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The man's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He didn't look at me, didn't speak for a long moment, and when he finally did, his voice was low, filled with exhaustion and something darker, resignation. "I don't know anymore," he said quietly. "Days. Weeks. It all blends together after a while. Time doesn't work the same in this place. The fog, it changes everything." His words sent a shiver down my spine. Time didn't work the same? What did that even mean? The thought that we could have been driving for hours, days even, and still be trapped in the same never-ending stretch of road was terrifying. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the fog had a way of distorting reality, making everything feel wrong. "There's no way out?" I asked, the desperation creeping into my voice. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it to confirm what I feared. The man's jaw clenched, and he shook his head slowly. "Not that I've found." I stared at him, my stomach sinking. "But you're still driving. You're still trying." He glanced at me for the first time since I'd gotten in the car, his eyes dark, filled with a quiet despair. "What else am I supposed to do?" he muttered. "If I stop, they'll take me." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. If we stopped, if the car broke down, if anything went wrong, we would be at the mercy of whatever lived in the fog. And based on what had happened to Jake, Mark, and Ellie, I knew we wouldn't survive. I turned back to the window, watching as the glowing eyes moved closer, shifting in and out of the fog, growing larger and more numerous. They were circling us now, like predators closing in for the kill. The car's engine strained as the man pushed it harder, the tires squealing as we sped through the winding road, but no matter how fast we went, the fog never thinned. It was everywhere, swallowing the road, the trees, and the sky. "How did this happen?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why are we here? What is this fog?" The man's expression darkened. "I've been asking myself that since the first day," he said grimly. "I was just passing through, like you. A normal day, clear skies, no signs of anything strange. And then, the fog rolled in. Fast. Too fast." I nodded, my heart sinking. It was the same for us. One moment we were driving, laughing, arguing about music, and the next, we were lost in this nightmare. "I've seen others," he continued, his voice hollow. "People like us. Lost. Desperate. Some of them tried to walk out. Others just gave up. The fog took them all." I shuddered, remembering the way Jake's eyes had glowed, the way his voice had turned cold and emotionless. He had been consumed by the fog, just like the others. Just like what would happen to us if we didn't find a way out. "There has to be something," I muttered, my mind racing. "Some kind of pattern, a way to escape." The man shook his head. "I've tried everything. Turning around, taking different roads, even driving off the main path. It always brings me back." I opened my mouth to respond, but then the car jerked violently to the side, throwing me against the door. The man cursed, yanking the steering wheel as the car skidded across the muddy road, tires spinning. For a terrifying moment, I thought we were going to crash, but the car steadied, regaining its grip on the road. I glanced out the window, my heart pounding. The fog was thicker now, swirling violently around the car, and the eyes, those terrible, glowing eyes, were closer than ever, darting through the mist like shadows. I could feel their presence, oppressive and cold, pressing against the windows, creeping closer with every second. "They're trying to force us off the road," the man muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "They've done this before." "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer. His face was pale, tense, as he fought to keep the car on the road. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that was gnawing at me, threatening to overwhelm me. I turned back to the window, my pulse racing. The glowing eyes were everywhere now, surrounding us on all sides, moving with the fog like living creatures. I could hear whispers, faint and distorted, coming from the mist. They were growing louder, more insistent, as if the fog itself was calling to us, pulling us deeper into its grasp. Suddenly, a dark shape appeared in the road ahead, looming out of the fog. My heart leapt into my throat. "Look out!" I screamed. The man slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded across the wet road. We spun wildly, the fog disorienting us, until the car finally came to a halt, inches away from the dark shape. It was a figure. At first, I thought it was another person, another lost soul like us. But as the fog shifted, revealing more of the figure, my blood turned to ice. It wasn't human. The figure was tall, unnaturally thin, its body twisted and elongated in impossible ways. Its skin, or what looked like skin, was pale and smooth, almost translucent, glowing faintly in the dim light. Its face was featureless, except for the eyes, those same glowing eyes that had been haunting us, watching us from the fog. Now they were right in front of us, staring directly at me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its glowing eyes fixed on me, as if it was waiting for something. The man beside me was frozen, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes wide with terror. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice shaking. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. I already knew. It was the fog. It had taken form, manifested in this creature, this thing. And now it was here, standing in front of us, blocking our path. For a long, terrifying moment, no one moved. The figure just stood there, silent, watching us, its glowing eyes burning into mine. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, suffocating, as if the very air around us had turned to ice. And then, without warning, the figure began to move. The figure moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its tall, distorted body swaying as it stepped toward the car. Each movement was fluid, unnatural, like a shadow slipping across water. I felt paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away from it. The fog swirled around the creature as if it were a part of it, as if the mist itself was an extension of its being. My breath caught in my throat. The glow of the creature's eyes intensified, burning through the dense fog like two tiny suns. They were focused on me now, piercing through the glass, drilling into my soul. I could feel its gaze deep in my chest, cold and unrelenting, as if the creature was stripping away every defense, every shield I had left. Beside me, the driver was trembling, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His breathing was shallow, ragged, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at the figure in the fog. "We can't stay here," he stammered, his voice cracking with fear. "We need to move." But I couldn't speak. I couldn't even nod. My whole body was locked in place, frozen by the sight of the thing standing before us. The creature continued to approach, its pale, almost translucent skin glowing faintly in the fog, its long limbs swaying with an eerie, hypnotic rhythm. It was closer now, just a few feet away from the car. Suddenly, the creature stopped. It tilted its head slightly, as if examining us, its glowing eyes narrowing. The fog around it thickened, pulsing in time with the flicker of the headlights, and I could hear a faint whispering sound, soft, distant, like voices carried on the wind. The sound filled the car, growing louder until it became a chorus of overlapping murmurs, indecipherable but undeniably malevolent. I could barely breathe. The pressure of the fog, the weight of the creature's gaze, the whispers, it all felt too much, as if the air itself was being sucked out of the car, leaving only the cold, damp suffocation of the mist. And then, the creature raised one of its elongated, skeletal arms. Slowly, deliberately, it pointed toward me. "Go!" I screamed, finding my voice in a surge of pure terror. "Get us out of here!" The driver snapped out of his trance, his foot slamming down on the accelerator. The engine roared as the car lurched forward, tires screeching on the slick, muddy road. The creature didn't move. It remained standing in the middle of the road, its glowing eyes tracking us as we sped past. For a brief, horrible moment, I thought it might reach out, might grab us with those long, bony fingers and pull us back into the fog. But it didn't. It just watched, its eyes burning through the mist as we raced away. I collapsed back into my seat, my heart pounding in my chest, every muscle in my body trembling with adrenaline. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the seatbelt just to steady myself. What was that?" I stammered, barely able to form the words. "What the hell was that?" The driver didn't answer immediately. His face was pale, his eyes wide and haunted, as if he hadn't fully registered what had just happened. His hands were still gripping the steering wheel with a deathly intensity, and I could hear the tremor in his breath as he tried to steady himself. "I've seen it before," he muttered finally, his voice low and hollow. "But never that close." I stared at him in disbelief. "You've seen it? What is it? What does it want?" The man shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I don't know. Nobody knows. It's a part of the fog, or maybe it is the fog. But every time I've seen it, someone disappears." His words sent a shiver down my spine. "What do you mean, disappears?" He didn't answer right away, his gaze still locked on the road ahead. "They just vanish," he said quietly. "One moment, they're there, and the next, gone. Like the fog swallows them whole." I felt a cold pit of dread form in my stomach. "Mark. Ellie. Jake. Is that what happened to them?" The man's silence was all the answer I needed. My mind raced, replaying the events of the past few hours, or days. I wasn't even sure anymore. The fog, the eyes, the way Jake had changed, the way he'd looked at me before he disappeared. Had the creature taken him? Was he still out there, somewhere in the fog, lost like the others? "We need to keep moving," the man said suddenly, his voice sharper now, more urgent. "We can't stop. Not for anything." I nodded, though the fear gnawing at me made it hard to think straight. The road stretched ahead of us, still shrouded in fog, with no end in sight. The glowing eyes had receded into the mist, but I knew they were still there, watching, waiting. The car jolted as we hit another rough patch of road, the tires skidding on the muddy surface. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the creature looming in the fog again, but there was nothing, just the thick, swirling mist, and the ever-present sense that something was wrong. And then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. It was coming from the roof of the car. The driver's eyes flicked upward, his face going pale. "Oh no! What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, as if something, or someone, was walking across the roof of the car. "It's them," the driver whispered, his voice trembling. "The ones who didn't make it out." I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me. The whispers in the fog, the glowing eyes, the creature, it was all connected. The fog didn't just take people. It kept them. And now, they were here, with us. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I could hear the faint creak of metal as something shifted on top of the car, moving with purpose. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The fog was alive. They were alive, in some twisted, horrible way. And they were coming for us. "We need to get out of here," I gasped, my voice shaking. "Now." "I'm trying," the driver muttered, his voice tight with fear. He pressed harder on the accelerator, but the car was struggling, the engine straining as we sped through the fog. The road had become rougher, narrower, and the mist thicker, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The tapping on the roof grew louder still, and I could feel the weight of whatever was up there shifting, moving closer to the edge of the car. My pulse raced, my body frozen with fear. I wanted to scream, to beg for help, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The fog had us now. And then, without warning, the car jerked violently to the side, the tires screeching as we skidded off the road. The driver cursed, yanking the steering wheel, but it was too late. The car spun out of control, the world around us becoming a blur of motion as the fog swallowed us whole. The car spun wildly as it skidded off the road, the tires screaming against the slick mud beneath us. My body was thrown to the side, slamming into the door as the world outside became a blur of motion. I could hear the driver shouting, struggling to control the wheel, but it was useless. The car was no longer ours to command. The fog wrapped around us like a living thing, thick and suffocating, obscuring everything beyond the windows. I couldn't see the road, couldn't see the trees, couldn't even tell which direction we were going anymore. All I knew was that we were off the path, lost in the swirling void of mist and shadows. Then, with a bone-jarring thud, the car came to a sudden stop. My body lurched forward, the seatbelt digging painfully into my chest, knocking the air from my lungs. For a moment, all I could hear was the ringing in my ears, the pounding of my heart echoing in the silence. The engine sputtered, choked, and died, plunging us into complete, suffocating darkness. I blinked, disoriented, trying to catch my breath. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, desperate for some sense of stability, but when I looked out the window, all I saw was fog. Endless, swirling fog, pressing against the glass, creeping inside the cracks like cold fingers reaching for me. The driver cursed under his breath, fumbling with the keys and the ignition. He twisted them, but the engine only groaned in protest, refusing to start. "We're stuck," he muttered, his voice tight with fear. "Damn it, we're stuck." Panic clawed in my chest, sharp and relentless. "What do we do now?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. He didn't answer. His eyes were wide, darting back and forth as if searching for something, some sign of hope, of escape, but there was nothing. Just the fog, thick and impenetrable, and the ever-present sense that we were being watched. The tapping on the roof had stopped, but I could still feel it, the weight of something unseen, something malevolent, hovering just above us. The whispers had faded into the background, distant and muffled, but they were still there, lurking in the fog, waiting. I glanced at the driver. His face was pale, beads of sweat clinging to his forehead. He was gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white, and his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. "We can't stay here," he said finally, his voice shaking. "They'll come for us if we stay." I nodded, though my mind was racing, filled with a growing sense of dread. If we left the car, we would be walking straight into the heart of the fog, straight into whatever was out there, waiting for us. But staying here felt just as dangerous. We were trapped, and the fog was closing in, tighter and tighter, like a noose around our throats. "What's out there?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What are we up against?" He hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the windshield. "I don't know. The fog, it's like it's alive. It plays tricks on you. Makes you see things, hear things. But it's real enough to kill you. I've seen it happen." I shivered, my mind flashing back to Jake's transformation, to the glowing eyes and his eerie, hollow voice. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just the fog. There were creatures, beings that moved within it, creatures like the one we had seen standing on the road. And worse, there were others. Those that had been taken by the fog, trapped within its cold embrace, twisted into something else. "Look," the driver said, interrupting my thoughts. "We can't wait. If we stay in the car, we're sitting ducks. We have to move. On foot." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him we were safer inside, but deep down, I knew he was right. The fog was relentless, creeping in on all sides, and if we didn't do something soon, it would swallow us whole. With shaking hands, I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for the door. The cold air rushed in as I opened it, the dampness of the fog immediately clinging to my skin, sending a shiver through me. The world outside the car was a void, a thick, swirling mass of mist that seemed to stretch on forever. I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of the fog as it moved. The driver stepped up beside me, his eyes scanning the mist with a wary, almost animalistic intensity. He was tense, his body coiled as if ready to spring into action at any moment. I could feel the fear radiating off him, the same fear that was gnawing at the edges of my own sanity. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "Don't wander off. The fog can mess with your head, make you see things that aren't there." I nodded, though my heart was pounding so loudly I wasn't sure I could hear him over it. The cold dampness of the fog pressed against my skin like a heavy blanket, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. We started walking, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of mud beneath us. The fog clung to us, swirling around our legs, making it feel as though we were wading through water. Every step felt like an effort, every movement slowed by the oppressive weight of the mist. I kept my eyes straight ahead, trying to ignore the shapes shifting in the fog around us, the vague, ghostly outlines that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Were they real? Or just tricks of the light, illusions created by the fog? "Do you see them?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The driver didn't answer. His jaw was clenched, his eyes scanning the mist with a grim determination. He was focused on keeping us moving, on getting us out of this nightmare. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands trembled when he thought I wasn't looking. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. a flash of movement in the fog. A dark, shifting shape, moving quickly, silently, just beyond the edge of my vision. I stopped, my heart racing, and turned to face it, but the shape was gone. The fog closed in around me, thick and impenetrable, swallowing whatever I had seen. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The driver stopped beside me, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the fog. "What?" There was something moving. Right there. I pointed into the mist, though I knew it was pointless. Whatever it was gone now, hidden in the thick veil of fog. He shook his head, his expression grim. "Keep moving. Don't stop for anything." We pressed on, the silence of the fog broken only by the squelching of our footsteps in the mud. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond our sight, grew stronger with every step. The whispers in the fog had returned, faint and distant, but growing louder, more insistent. I could feel the eyes on me, countless pairs of glowing eyes watching us from the shadows, closing in. "Faster," the driver muttered, his pace quickening. "We need to move faster." But as we sped up, so did the whispers. They were everywhere now, surrounding us, echoing in the mist, overlapping and blending together until they became a cacophony of voices. And within those voices, I heard something else, laughter. Cold, hollow laughter, echoing from somewhere deep in the fog. I glanced at the driver, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you hear that?" His eyes were wide with fear, his face pale. "We need to run." The urgency in the driver's voice sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I turned, my feet moving before I even realized it. We raced forward, the fog swirling around us like a living thing, wrapping its tendrils around our legs and pulling us back. Every step felt labored, as if the air itself was trying to keep us grounded, to stop us from escaping. "Keep moving. Don't look back," the driver urged, his breath coming in quick, desperate gasps. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, the rhythm of my pulse echoing in my ears. The laughter in the fog grew louder, more taunting, a cruel reminder of our vulnerability. It felt like 1,000 voices were whispering just beyond the veil, mocking us, drawing us further into the abyss. The ground beneath us became uneven, rocks and roots jutting up from the mud, threatening to trip us as we stumbled forward. I could barely see the path ahead, the mist obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Each shadow felt alive, and I could swear I caught glimpses of shapes flitting through the fog, their forms twisting and turning as if they were dancing just out of reach. "Faster," the driver shouted, his eyes wild. "We have to." He was cut off by a sudden, sharp sound, like a scream, but not quite. It pierced through the fog, echoing off the trees, chilling me to my core. I froze, fear gripping my throat as the sound faded into silence. "What was that?" I gasped, glancing around as the fog thickened around us. "Just keep going," he shouted, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the way he glanced over his shoulder as if expecting something to come barreling out of the mist. We pushed ourselves to run faster, our breaths ragged, the laughter now morphing into a chorus of shrieks that rose and fell like waves crashing against the shore. My legs felt heavy, each step more difficult than the last, as if the fog were siphoning my strength away. "Don't stop," he urged, his voice breaking. "Whatever you do, don't stop." But the ground began to shift beneath us, and I felt myself slipping, losing my footing in the thick mud. The driver reached out, grabbing my arm just in time, yanking me back before I could fall. I could see the panic in his eyes, and it mirrored my own. We were lost, trapped in a fog that felt more like a living entity than just a weather phenomenon. I could feel its malevolent presence closing in, suffocating me, and the whispers grew louder, echoing my fears. "Is anyone there?" I called into the fog, my voice trembling. "Help! We need help." There was no response, only the laughter, so cruel, so mocking. It felt as if the very mist itself was toying with us, savoring our desperation. "Stay close," the driver shouted, pulling me back into the fray. "We can't give up now." But as we stumbled forward, I began to feel a change in the air. The temperature dropped suddenly, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into my bones. My breath came out in frosty puffs, and I could see the mist swirling thicker, darker around us. "We need to find shelter," I gasped, trying to steady my racing heart. "Somewhere to hide." "There's nothing out here," he shouted back, his voice strained. "We have to keep moving." But the ground felt unstable, and the laughter had turned into something more sinister. It was low now, rumbling, reverberating through the very ground we stood upon. I felt the earth tremble beneath us, a warning sign that something was coming. I glanced back, and my blood ran cold. In the distance, barely visible through the thick fog, there were shapes emerging, figures moving with a twisted grace, their forms shifting and flickering like shadows in the dim light. I could see the faint glow of their eyes, countless pairs watching us, hungry and predatory. "Run!" I screamed, but the command felt hollow. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The figures drew closer, their laughter echoing, a cacophony that drowned out my thoughts. We sprinted deeper into the fog, but the laughter swelled around us, enveloping us in a cocoon of dread. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and flee, but I was rooted in place, paralyzed by the sight of the figures advancing toward us, their movements fluid and unnatural. "What do we do?" I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. "They're coming for us." "I don't know," the driver replied, his voice breaking. "We can't let them catch us." With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a cluster of trees that loomed ahead, their silhouettes dark and foreboding against the mist. "Over there. We can hide." We dashed toward the trees, but as we reached them, the fog swirled and thickened around us, wrapping around the trunks like serpents. I could feel the pressure closing in, the whispers rising to a fever pitch, drowning out my thoughts. "Please," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Leave us alone." The driver pulled me close, his eyes wide with terror as he pressed against the rough bark of the tree, desperately scanning the shadows. "They can't see us if we stay still," he whispered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. I nodded, though the fear coursing through me made it hard to think. I pressed my back against the tree, trying to become one with the shadows. The figures were now just beyond the trees, moving with an unsettling grace, their eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. One of them stepped forward, and my heart stopped. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her long hair swirling in the fog like tendrils of smoke. Her eyes were wide and vacant, yet there was a flicker of recognition there, a spark of humanity buried beneath the surface. "Help us," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We're lost." But instead of speaking, she tilted her head, her lips curling into a smile that sent a chill down my spine. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the trees, drowning out my pleas. I felt the driver stiffen beside me, his body rigid with fear as more figures emerged, their shapes twisting and contorting, the fog swirling around them. They were all around us now, closing in, the coldness of their presence suffocating. "Don't move," he murmured, his breath ghosting against my ear. Just stay quiet. But it was too late. The laughter erupted into a cacophony, and the figures surged forward, their glowing eyes locking onto us. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I broke free from the tree, stumbling back into the thick fog. Run! I screamed, but my feet felt heavy, the ground pulling at me like quicksand. I didn't look back. I could hear the figures behind us, the sound of their laughter echoing in the fog, growing closer. The cold seeped into my bones, and with each step I took, I felt as if I was being dragged down into the depths of the fog. We sprinted forward, the world a blur of gray and shadows, the laughter becoming a chorus of shrieks, chasing us through the mist. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and the sense of dread clung to me like a shroud. Then, suddenly, I tripped, my foot catching on a hidden root. I went down hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. The fog surged around me, swirling like a storm, and I could feel the cold creeping in, wrapping around my limbs like ice. No! I screamed, panic surging through me as I struggled to get back up. I could hear the figures closing in, their laughter echoing in the darkness. They were right there, just moments away from catching me. The driver grabbed my arm, pulling me back to my feet, his eyes wild with fear. Get up! We have to go. I stumbled forward, his grip steadying me, but I could feel the figures closing in, their whispers rising into a frenzy. I glanced back for just a moment, and the sight of their glowing eyes sent a wave of terror crashing over me. They were right there, reaching out with long, skeletal fingers, hungry for my fear. With a final surge of adrenaline, we broke free of the trees and ran into the open, the fog swirling around us, pushing back against our momentum. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I felt the tears welling in my eyes as I fought to keep moving. Where do we go? I gasped, desperation clawing at my throat. Anywhere but here, he shouted back, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. But as we pressed on, the fog began to shift, revealing a faint outline in the distance, a structure, dark and foreboding. A cabin? A shed? I couldn't tell, but it stood alone, its silhouette barely visible through the swirling mist. Over there! I shouted, pointing. Let's go! We sprinted toward the structure, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers and laughter grew louder, but I could see the outline of the building growing clearer as we approached. It was our only chance, our only hope of finding shelter from whatever horrors lurked within the fog. As we reached the door, I turned the handle, and to my surprise, it opened with a creak, revealing darkness within. The driver hesitated for just a moment, his eyes flicking over his shoulder, but then he pulled me inside, slamming the door shut behind us. The silence inside was almost deafening. I leaned against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The darkness enveloped us, and I could barely see anything beyond a few feet. What now? I panted, trying to catch my breath. Are we safe? I don't know, he admitted, his voice low and tense. But we can't stay in the open. We need to find a way to barricade the door. I nodded, scanning the dim interior for anything we could use. The cabin was old and decrepit, with cobwebs hanging in the corners and a musty smell that filled the air. A table stood in the center of the room, and I hurried toward it, trying to shove it against the door. Help me! I shouted, struggling to move the heavy wooden frame. Together, we managed to wedge the table against the door, but I could still hear the whispers outside, echoing through the walls. The figures were out there, still searching for us, their laughter ringing in my ears. "We have to find a way to defend ourselves," the driver said, his voice tense. "Do you see anything we can use?" I glanced around the dim cabin, spotting a rusted old axe hanging on the wall, its blade dulled and coated in dust. "Over there." I pointed, my heart racing. "The axe." He nodded and hurried to grab it, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted it from the wall. "This might help," he said, gripping the handle tightly. As he turned back toward me, a crash sounded from outside, the door rattling violently as something slammed against it. I jumped back, my heart racing as the whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls. "Stay back," the driver shouted, brandishing the axe as the door shook again. The whispers turned into a chorus of mocking laughter, filling the air with an oppressive weight. "What do we do?" I gasped, panic rising in my throat. "We wait," he replied, his eyes focused on the door. "We wait and hope they can't get in." But as I pressed myself against the wall, I could feel the fog seeping in through the cracks, cold and clammy. It was alive, wrapping around me like a serpent, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The door rattled again, and I could hear the figures outside, their laughter echoing through the cabin, taunting us. "Help us!" I screamed into the darkness, but my voice was swallowed by the fog, lost to the wind. The driver clenched the axe tighter, his knuckles turning white as the door shook again, and I felt a surge of hopelessness wash over me. We were trapped, lost in the fog, surrounded by creatures that thrived on our fear. Suddenly, the door burst open, the table flying back as a figure lunged into the cabin. I screamed, stumbling backward as the driver swung the axe, striking the figure hard. It stumbled back, but more shapes were behind it, pouring in through the door like a tidal wave. "Run!" the driver yelled, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear as the figures surged into the room, their glowing eyes locking onto me. I turned and ran, darting through the cabin, desperate to find another way out, but the laughter grew louder, echoing off the walls, filling my head until I couldn't think straight. "Get out!" the driver shouted, swinging the axe again as he fought off the encroaching figures. I could see the terror in his eyes, the determination to protect me even as the shadows closed in. I stumbled into a darkened room at the back of the cabin, slamming the door behind me. I pressed my back against it, my heart racing as I fumbled in the darkness, searching for something, anything, that could help us escape. The whispers grew louder outside, the figures closing in on the driver, their laughter a sickening chorus that filled the air. I could hear him shouting, the sound of the axe striking flesh, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming noise of the fog, the relentless tide of shadows pressing in. "Help!" I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Suddenly, I spotted a small window at the far side of the room, the glass grimy and cracked. I rushed toward it, my heart pounding as I threw open the window, the cold air rushing in like a breath of fresh hope. "Come on!" I shouted, glancing back toward the door. I could hear the chaos unfolding behind me, the sounds of struggle and despair echoing through the cabin. But I couldn't leave him behind. I hesitated, torn between the need to escape and the instinct to stay and fight. "Go!" the driver shouted from the other room, his voice strained. "I'll hold them off." "No!" I screamed, my heart aching. "I can't leave you." But he was already fighting, already facing the darkness with everything he had. I could hear the sound of the axe striking, the figures laughing, closing in. With a final surge of determination, I climbed through the window, my heart racing as I landed in a thicket of brush outside. The fog swirled around me, thick and suffocating, but I had to keep moving. I turned to look back at the cabin, my heart heavy with dread as I heard the cries echoing within. The shadows loomed in the doorway, flickering in and out of existence, a reminder of the horrors I had left behind. The driver was still fighting, still holding them off, but I knew it wouldn't last long. I had to escape, had to find a way to survive. The forest was a maze of shadows, the fog thickening around me as I stumbled deeper into the trees. I could hear the whispers again, calling to me, taunting me with promises of despair. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to find a way to escape the nightmare that had ensnared us. I pressed on, the cold air biting into my skin as I navigated the twisting paths of the woods. The laughter echoed behind me, a haunting reminder of the horrors that lay just beyond the fog. With every step, I felt the darkness closing in, the weight of the fog pressing down on me. But I refused to give in to fear. I had to find a way out before it consumed me entirely. I pushed deeper into the woods, my heart racing and my breath coming in quick gasps. The laughter faded slightly, but it was still there, echoing in the back of my mind, a haunting reminder that the figures were not far behind. Each rustle of leaves, each snap of a twig felt magnified, and I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me from every direction. The fog curled around the trees like a living entity, thick and oppressive, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I stumbled forward, trying to keep my bearings, but it felt like the forest was shifting around me, disorienting me at every turn. My heart was heavy with guilt and fear. I had left the driver behind, abandoned him in a desperate bid for survival. The thought gnawed at me, but I couldn't let it consume me. I had to live. After what felt like hours, I found a small clearing, and I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion. The fog hung thick, but I could see the moonlight filtering through the trees, casting pale beams onto the forest floor. I took a moment to catch my breath, the cool night air filling my lungs, refreshing yet tainted with the acrid smell of the fog. But peace was short-lived. The laughter surged again, louder and closer this time, echoing through the trees like a death knell. Panic gripped me as I scrambled to my feet, heart racing. I had to keep moving. I couldn't let them find me. I darted back into the trees, the branches scratching at my arms and face as I pushed through the underbrush. The whispers were louder now, clearer, a cacophony of voices merging into a single, chilling melody. I could feel their presence all around me, the figures lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to falter. As I ran, I spotted a narrow path leading off to my right, half hidden by the thick foliage. I hesitated for a moment, listening intently. The laughter had grown distant, momentarily replaced by the sound of my own ragged breath. With no other options, I veered onto the path, hoping it would lead me away from the darkness. The path twisted and turned, and I felt my heart slow as I gained distance. I forced myself to focus on my surroundings, the familiar sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animals scurrying through the underbrush. It felt reassuring, a reminder that I was still in the natural world, far from the horrors that lurked behind me. But the reprieve was brief. As I pressed on, I caught sight of something in the distance, a flicker of light through the trees. Hope surged within me. Maybe it was a campsite, a cabin, or even a road leading back to civilization. I pushed myself to run faster, determination overriding the exhaustion that weighed down my limbs. As I neared the light, I realized it was coming from a small cabin, much like the one I had escaped. The windows glowed softly, and I could see the outline of a porch, inviting and warm. I felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. Would this cabin be a refuge or another trap? I approached cautiously, my heart pounding as I stepped onto the creaky porch. I knocked on the door, my knuckles rapping against the wood, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I called, my voice shaky. For a moment, there was silence, and dread crept back into my heart. Then, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with a kind, weathered face. Her eyes widened as she took in my appearance, hair wild and clothes torn. "What happened to you, dear?" she asked, her voice gentle yet firm. "There's something in the fog," I gasped, barely able to catch my breath. "It's hunting us." Come in," she urged, stepping aside to allow me entry. "You'll be safe here." I hesitated for just a moment, glancing back into the dark woods, the laughter fading but still lingering in my mind. Then I stepped inside, relief washing over me as I crossed the threshold. The warmth of the cabin enveloped me, and I felt the weight of fear begin to lift. The woman closed the door behind me, sealing out the cold and the fog. She guided me to a small table where a kettle was boiling on the stove. "You must be freezing," she said, pouring a cup of steaming tea. "Sit and tell me everything." I took a seat at the table, my hands shaking as I wrapped them around the warm cup. I could feel the warmth seeping into my bones, but the terror of what I had experienced was still fresh in my mind. I recounted the tale, the fog, the eyes, the figures that had chased me through the woods. The woman listened intently, her expression growing somber. "I've heard stories of that fog," she said quietly when I finished. "It's said to be a portal, a place where those who have been lost can never find their way back. The eyes, they are the souls trapped within it, forever searching for a way out." "What do we do?" I asked, panic rising once more. "How do I escape it?" She looked at me, her gaze steady and wise. "You must confront the fear," she said softly. "You must face the darkness within yourself. Only then can you break its hold." "But I can't," I cried, tears brimming in my eyes. "I'm so afraid." "Fear is powerful, yes, but it can also be a guide," she replied gently. "You've already taken the first step by seeking shelter. Now, you must find your strength." I nodded, trying to absorb her words, but doubt still clawed at my mind. "What if it comes for me again?" "It may," she said, her expression unyielding. "But you will not be alone. If you believe in yourself, if you hold on to the light, it cannot touch you." As I sat in the warm cabin, the shadows flickering in the corners, I felt a sense of determination building within me. I had come too far to let fear take control now. I had to confront what lurked in the fog, what had chased me through the woods. The night wore on, and I could feel the weight of sleep creeping in. The woman offered me a bed, and I gratefully accepted, exhaustion pulling me under. As I lay in the small room, wrapped in a blanket, I felt a glimmer of hope ignite within me. But sleep didn't come easily. Images of the figures and their glowing eyes danced in my mind, the laughter echoing through the fog. I knew that confronting my fear meant returning to that darkness, but I also knew I had to try. With the first light of dawn breaking through the trees, I awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. I thanked the woman for her kindness, her words still resonating in my mind. "You can do this," she had said. "Remember, you hold the light within you." I stepped outside, the fog still clinging to the trees, but the light of day pierced through, illuminating the path ahead. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. The laughter was faint, but I could still hear it in the distance, a reminder of the darkness that loomed. I began walking back toward the fog, the weight of the world pressing down on me, but I felt stronger this time. I would face the fear that had haunted me, confront the shadows that lurked within. I would not be a victim anymore. As I stepped into the fog, I felt a surge of resolve wash over me. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm, but I pressed on, determined to face whatever lay ahead. I could feel the eyes watching me, the figures lurking just beyond the veil, but I held onto the light within me, a beacon against the darkness. "Show yourselves," I shouted, my voice ringing out against the oppressive silence. "I am not afraid of you." The laughter rose to a crescendo, echoing through the fog, but I stood my ground, refusing to be cowed. The figures began to emerge, their forms twisting and contorting in the mist, their eyes glowing with hunger and malice. But I didn't flinch. I took a step forward, then another, until I was surrounded by the figures. Their laughter turned to shrieks, the cacophony of voices rising as they pressed closer, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions. "I know what you are," I yelled, feeling the power of my voice. "You're nothing but fear. You don't control me anymore." With every word, I felt the light within me grow stronger, pushing back against the shadows that surrounded me. The laughter faltered, the figures drawing back as if repelled by the strength of my conviction. "Leave me," I shouted, my voice echoing in the fog. "You have no power here." The figures recoiled, their forms flickering as they faded into the mist. I could feel the fog lifting, the pressure around me dissipating as I stood my ground. The whispers began to fade, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves, the sounds of the forest waking around me. As the last of the figures vanished into the fog, I took a deep breath, my heart racing. I had faced my fear and emerged victorious. The darkness that had once consumed me began to recede, replaced by the light of dawn breaking through the trees. I turned and walked away from the fog, the forest coming alive around me, each step bringing me closer to the warmth of the sun. I had survived the night, confronted the shadows, and emerged stronger. As I walked toward the clearing, I glanced back one last time. The fog was lifting, revealing the path back to the cabin, the place that had saved me. I felt gratitude wash over me, knowing that I would carry the lessons learned in the darkness with me. And so I stepped forward, ready to embrace the light. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.